Welcome back, warriors. Kwe Tansei Sego. My name is Pam Palmater, and my YouTube channel focuses on educating the resistance and empowering the next generation of warriors to help us protect the people and the planet. Today is part 2 of my series on the National Inquiry's final report on murdered and missing Indigenous women. We're going to be talking specifically about genocide, so stay tuned. Today, I'll be talking to you about the 3 most important things you need to understand from the supplementary report on genocide from the National Inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. The most important point to talk about is number 1, the definition of genocide. It would be absolutely irresponsible to even have this conversation or offer an opinion unless you truly know what the definition of genocide is. And part of the problem in the media is that the vast majority don't. They think that Holocaust is the standard, and it's not. It's one of the most horrific ways in which a genocide can occur, but it's not the only way. So first of all, genocide is a crime in customary international law. And what that means is it doesn't have to be written down in a book, it doesn't have to be written down in a treaty, it doesn't have to be agreed to by anyone. This is the law that has developed over many decades at the international level. So even without a treaty on genocide, it is still against the law and a crime to commit genocide. However, genocide is now also recognized as a crime in the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide that was adopted in 1948. And it's extremely important to understand that Canada is bound both by customary international law and by this UN Convention to address the crime of genocide. Now, I'm not going to read the whole convention, but there's 3 really important parts that you need to understand. The first one is Article 2, which talks about what is genocide? How is it defined at the international level? So Article 2 says, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And then it lists 5 criteria that are considered to be genocide, and you need only be guilty of 1. The first one is killing members of that particular group. The second one is causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of that group. The third one is deliberately inflicting the conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of the group in whole or in part. The fourth one is imposing measures that are intended to prevent births within a group. And the 5th one is the forcible transfer of children from one group to another. Now, Article 3 is very specific about the type of crime that is involved here. And you can be guilty of any one of these 5 things. 1, genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, direct and public incitement to commit genocide, an attempt to commit genocide, or complicity in genocide. Now, Article 4 talks about who is it that is responsible here. And it says, persons committing genocide or any of the other acts that I listed above earlier shall be punished whether they are constitutional rulers, public officials, or private individuals. It is important for all of you to know exactly what the law is so that you can find a way to filter out all of the noise that's in both mainstream media and social media and know for yourself what genocide is. And yes, sadly, genocide happened here historically and continues to happen to Indigenous women and girls in Canada in really horrendous ways. So the second most important thing to get from this supplementary report is not just the definition of genocide, but that Canada is actually guilty of genocide. And I think we need to hear that and say that over and over and over until it sinks in. The National Inquiry heard from literally thousands of family members, expert witnesses, and they did their own legal research and their own legal analysis to come up with this finding that Canada is indeed guilty of genocide. It's a finding that we need to take very, very seriously. And specifically, they found that Canada is guilty of genocide, a race-based genocide that targeted Indigenous women and girls. And that's important to remember, and in order to understand how this crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls came about in the first place. And I'm going to quote a very important section from their report because I think it is fundamental to understanding their finding. This genocide has been empowered by colonial structures, evidenced notably by the Indian Act, the 60s scoop, residential schools, and breaches of human rights and Indigenous rights, leading directly to the current increased rates of violence, death, and suicide in Indigenous communities. And that comes directly from the National Inquiry's final report. I feel a little bit like I'm a broken record, but this finding is simply not up for debate. It is based on evidence, it is based on experts, it is based on legal analysis, and that is the finding of a national public inquiry. And it is important to remember, this isn't the first time that we've heard this. The report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which looked at all of the atrocities that happened in residential schools, said very specifically that in all of its dealings with Indigenous peoples, Canada is guilty of genocide. Not just cultural genocide, but physical and biological genocide as well. And that is exceptionally important to understand here. This isn't news, but the country is acting like this is the first time anyone has ever uttered the word here in this country. But I'm not surprised by the reaction. State perpetrators of genocide all over the world are the first to deny that they are perpetrators of genocide. Most perpetrators of any violence, even on an individual level, will deny any responsibility for the violence and the harm that they have caused. What is a surprise, though, is that the people in the media or journalists or on social media thinking that they know more than the National Inquiry, they know more than genocide experts, or they know more about the actual victims themselves and survivors about what is happening in this country to Indigenous women and girls. And their voices have been silenced for too long. It's important that we understand what's happened, what continues to happen, and find a way to stop it. The third most important thing to understand about this supplementary report on genocide are all of the insidious ways in which Canada as a state targeted Indigenous women and girls in unique and horrific ways throughout all of their genocidal laws, policies, and practices. Now, the National Inquiry considered the following things to be examples of genocide committed by Canada: the deaths of Indigenous women and girls in police custody, the failure to protect Indigenous women and girls from sexual exploitation and human trafficking, the failure to protect them from known killers, the taking of the children of Indigenous women and girls and forcing them to live in other families, most notably non-Indigenous families. It also includes the physical, mental, and sexual abuse experienced on a large-scale basis by Indigenous women and girls in state institutions, not just residential schools, but hospitals, mental health facilities, healing centers, prisons, corrections, you name it, and Indigenous women and girls have been targets by state agents. It also includes the denial of Indian status and band membership to Indigenous women and their children for many, many, many decades, separating them from their communities, denying them their core treaty rights and Aboriginal rights, and breaking up families. That's a core element of genocide. We can't forget about the forced and coerced sterilizations that happened both in the past and are ongoing. and the purposeful and chronic and discriminatory underfunding of essential human services like food, water, housing. Many of those things have been denied to Indigenous women and girls, and that is why they suffer from such severe socioeconomic conditions. And all of that is all in addition to Canada's history of premeditated killings, which were done in a variety of forms, like purposely using smallpox blankets to kill off our populations, having scalping bounties to kill people, to completely extinguish certain Indigenous groups like the Beothuk in the Maritime provinces. All of these things were premeditated murders. None of them were, oops, sorry, we didn't mean to do that. They were calculated. And of course, we can't forget about the ethnic cleansing that was done on the prairies to force Indigenous peoples off the land so that settler governments and settlers could come and use it. And that's a very important aspect of genocide. And I want to quote from the supplementary report. Canada's colonial history provides ample evidence of the existence of a genocidal policy, a manifest pattern of similar conduct which reflects an intention to destroy Indigenous peoples. And I don't think on the historical, legal, social, political record that can be refuted. They went on to conclude, Canada has displayed a continuous policy, albeit with shifting expressed motives, but ultimately a steady intention to destroy Indigenous peoples physically, biologically, and as social units. The National Inquiry could come to no other conclusion but that Canada is guilty of genocide when it comes to the murders, disappearances, exploitation, and trafficking of Indigenous women and girls in this country. So instead of denying it or debating it or ignoring it, what we need to do collectively is work together and act on it. So to sum up, in this video, I talked about the 3 most important things you need to understand about the National Inquiry's supplementary report on genocide. The first is the definition of genocide, and it includes more than just the Holocaust. Number 2 is that Canada's actually guilty of genocide, and that we need to accept that conclusion. And number 3 is the very particular ways in which Canada targeted Indigenous women and girls in this genocide. Thank you for watching my channel. What I'll do is I'll post a link in the description box down below that goes specifically to the supplementary report on genocide. It's very short, it's only 27 pages excluding all the footnotes, and you'll be able to read it in just less than an hour. But I think it's important that every single Canadian does read it and does understand it and start pushing back against the media and their commentators who clearly haven't read the report. So stay tuned for my next video in this series, which looks at the very specific calls for justice in this final report and what we can do as a collective to take action on Canada's genocide against Indigenous women and girls. If this is your first time here, please consider subscribing, liking the video, sharing your comments below, or sharing the link with all of your family and friends and social justice activists so that we can take some action. Till next time, stay alert, warriors.